Ladies and gentlemen, historians, aviation enthusiasts, and seekers of inspiration. Today, I want to take you back to a time when the sky was not a place of peace, but a battleground, when the outcome of wars was decided not only by brave pilots or powerful machines, but by the brilliant minds working quietly behind the scenes. This is the story of how one civilian, a man without wings or rank, changed the course of aerial warfare. It is the story of how his impossible trick made America's legendary P-38 Lightning almost untouchable. During World War II, the skies over Europe and the Pacific were dominated by relentless dogfights. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was already a marvel of engineering, twin engines, twin booms, and a top speed that made it a fearsome predator. But even great machines can have weaknesses. The P-38 had one, and it was deadly. At high altitudes, pilots reported that their controls would lock up in dives. The nose would drop, the aircraft would accelerate past the point of no return, and the pilot could do nothing but hope. Many never came back. The problem was aerodynamic compression. The airplane approached transonic speeds, and the air pressure around the control surfaces changed in unpredictable ways. For the first time, humans were touching the edge of the sound barrier, and no one fully understood how to tame it. Lockheed's engineers, test pilots, and even the US Army Air Forces were baffled. Every fix seemed to fail. For months, brilliant minds turned data into frustration. But then, a civilian engineer named Ben Kelsey brought in another civilian who would dare to do the unthinkable, a man named Kelly Johnson. Johnson was not a typical engineer. He wasn't satisfied with numbers that almost worked or explanations that almost made sense. He believed that innovation came from breaking the rules, carefully, but boldly. At the time, aerodynamic theory said that controlling shockwaves at high speed was impossible with the technology available. But Johnson refused to accept impossible. He began to think differently. Instead of trying to change the laws of physics, he tried to work with them. He studied how air flowed over wings, how control surfaces flexed, and how the shockwaves behaved during dives. What he proposed seemed absurd to many. A tiny dive recovery flap that could deploy under the wings when the plane entered a steep dive. On paper, it looked too simple to solve such a deadly problem. Critics said it wouldn't work. But Johnson was certain. The trick, he said, is not to stop the dive, it's to give the pilot control of it. When the first test flight was conducted, the P-38 entered a high-speed dive just as it had before. The airframe began to shake violently. Then, as the pilot extended the small flaps, something extraordinary happened. The nose lifted, the controls freed, and the aircraft pulled out safely. It worked. That tiny invention, that impossible trick, saved lives. It made the P-38 not just fast but controllable, even at the edge of the sound barrier. Soon, P-38 pilots began to dominate the skies again. They could dive faster, strike harder, and escape more easily than ever before. The aircraft that had once been feared by its own pilots became feared by the enemy. Johnson's innovation became one of the earliest successful applications of what we now call aerodynamic flow control. It was a glimpse into the future of supersonic flight. His idea paved the way for generations of aircraft that could push beyond old limits, from jet fighters to experimental X-planes and even spacecraft. But this story is not just about technology, it's about vision. It's about a civilian who stood at the edge of known science and said, "Let's go further." It's about a man who saw beyond blueprints and equations, who understood that progress is born not from certainty but from curiosity. It's about what happens when courage meets creativity, when one person refuses to let the word, "how possible," end the conversation. The P-38 became one of the most iconic fighters of World War II. It escorted bombers across Europe, struck Japanese bases in the Pacific, and even carried out the daring mission that brought down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Each time a lightning roared into the sky, it carried with it the legacy of that one small, brilliant idea. Today, when we see advanced stealth fighters or hypersonic aircraft slicing through the stratosphere, we are witnessing the ripple of that same spark. The idea that innovation begins with a question, not an answer. So, what can we learn from this story? That heroes don't always wear uniforms. That genius sometimes hides in garages, laboratories, or drafting rooms. And that sometimes, one person's refusal to believe in impossible can tilt the balance of history. Kelly Johnson's impossible trick didn't just save pilots. It saved faith in the power of human ingenuity. It showed that every challenge, no matter how complex, carries within it the seeds of its own solution. If only we dare to look differently. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look to our own skis, of technology, of discovery, of dreams, let us remember that progress is not a straight line. It's a dive, sometimes terrifying, into the unknown. And like Johnson's flaps, what saves us is our ability to lift the nose, steady the course, and believe that there's always a way forward. Because history is not written by those who say, "Can't be done." It's written by those who prove that it can. Thank you. When America entered World War II, its skies were filled with ambition, hope, and urgency. The United States Army Air Forces needed a fighter that could meet the demands of a new kind of war, one that stretched across continents and oceans, one that demanded speed, altitude, endurance, and precision. In response, Lockheed designed a plane that looked like nothing else in the sky, the P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms, central cockpit pod, and powerful twin engines. It was an aircraft that seemed born from the future, It was faster, more powerful, and more advanced than almost anything flying in those early years of the war. Pilots nicknamed it the fork-tailed devil, and enemies learned to fear its silhouette glinting in the sunlight. But for all its beauty and brilliance, the P-38 harbored a deadly secret, one that would threaten to undo everything it represented. At first, everything about the P-38 suggested success. Its twin Allison V-1710 engines could push it to speeds that earlier planes could only dream of. Its range made it the first American fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. And its firepower, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon mounted in the nose, meant it could destroy enemy aircraft with a single devastating burst. Pilots who trained in it described the Lightning as powerful and graceful, like a predator built for speed and precision. It could climb higher, dive faster, and strike harder than almost any other fighter of its era. It seemed to be the very embodiment of American ingenuity and engineering mastery. Yet, as the first squadrons began to train and deploy, strange and terrifying reports began to filter back. Pilots returning from test flights spoke of a chilling phenomenon. When the P-38 entered a steep dive from high altitude, the controls would suddenly stiffen. The stick became immovable, as though frozen in place. The nose of the aircraft would drop, the speed would increase rapidly, and the pilot's desperate attempts to pull up were useless. The Lightning would plunge toward the Earth like a missile, accelerating faster and faster until it shattered on impact. Those who survived such dives described the sensation as being trapped inside a machine that had turned against them. A living nightmare from which there was no escape. At first, many assumed it was pilot error. Some thought the aircraft's controls had been misrigged or that its twin-engine layout created aerodynamic instability. Mechanics checked the hydraulic systems, engineers ran tests, and pilots tried different techniques. But nothing worked. Time and again, test flights ended in disaster. Brave men died trying to understand why an aircraft so advanced could behave so unpredictably. The problem seemed almost supernatural, as if the laws of flight themselves had turned hostile. The very thing that gave the P-38 its unmatched speed, its aerodynamic design, had also made it dangerously unstable in ways no one fully understood. The truth, as engineers would eventually learn, was that the Lightning was brushing against a frontier that no airplane had crossed before, the edge of the sound barrier. At extremely high speeds near 500 miles per hour, the air flowing over certain parts of the aircraft began to compress, creating shockwaves. This compressibility effect caused dramatic changes in lift and control. The tail surfaces, instead of responding smoothly to the pilot's commands, became locked in a downward force, pushing the nose even steeper. The harder the pilot pulled back on the controls, the more resistance he felt. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. In the 1940s, the science of aerodynamics simply wasn't advanced enough to predict or manage such effects. No one had truly encountered compressibility before because no one had built a plane fast enough to experience it. For the young pilots of the Air Corps, it was a terrifying reality. In training manuals, instructors warned, do not exceed certain dive speeds. But in combat, when a pilot was fighting for his life, such warnings often went unheeded. A steep dive was a common maneuver to escape an enemy attack or to pursue a fleeing target. Yet with the P-38, a dive too steep meant a death spiral. Many promising aviators, men with families, dreams, and courage beyond measure, vanished in seconds, leaving only smoke and wreckage. For every life lost, questions mounted. Could the P-38 truly be trusted? Was its speed an advantage or a curse? Within the halls of Lockheed, frustration grew. Engineers pored over blueprints and data, searching for clues. The military applied pressure, demanding answers. The air forces needed the Lightning. Its range and speed were essential for upcoming missions in both Europe and the Pacific. But an aircraft that killed its own pilots was not a weapon. It was a liability. The reputation of the P-38 began to suffer. Rumors spread among pilots. If you dive in a Lightning, you dive in a Lightning. Morale faltered. Commanders hesitated to assign the aircraft to key missions. Some even proposed canceling production until a solution could be found. And yet, even amidst fear and tragedy, the P-38 remained too valuable to abandon. No other American fighter could match its long-range performance at that stage of the war. In the Pacific, where vast stretches of ocean separated islands, range was everything. The Lightning could escort bombers farther than any P-40 or P-47. It could reach Japanese bases that other fighters could not. It was the only plane that could make certain missions possible. Missions that could alter the balance of the war. But to unlock that potential, someone had to solve the mystery of its deadly dives. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted exhaustive tests at Muroc Field in California, today known as Edwards Air Force Base. They built special instruments to measure the pressures and stresses on the airframe during high-speed dives. Test pilots risked their lives to gather data, diving to terrifying speeds while every nerve in their bodies screamed for them to pull up. Some of these men never returned. The data they recorded would later become the foundation of high-speed aerodynamics, but at the time it was only pain and peril. The reports were clear. At around Mach 0.68, airflow over the wings began to separate, forming shockwaves that disrupted control. But knowing the cause was not the same as finding a cure. Engineers tried modifying the tail, adjusting control cables, changing the shape of the wings, even adding balance weights. Each attempt seemed to fix one issue while creating another. The problem was more complex than any single mechanical flaw. It was a symptom of nature itself, the air reacting to speed in ways that human understanding had not yet caught up with. Some scientists even believed that no aircraft could ever safely fly faster than the speed of sound. They spoke of a sound barrier, an invisible wall that marked the limit of flight. To many, it seemed that the P-38 had simply reached that limit too soon. The psychological toll was heavy. Lockheed's engineers felt they had failed their pilots. The military feared losing confidence in one of its most advanced designs. Test pilots were torn between duty and dread. Every flight was an act of courage, a balance between science and survival. In the skies above California, where the desert winds whispered of broken wings and vanished heroes, the P-38's reputation hung in the balance. It is important to understand that the crisis of the P-38 Lightning was not just a mechanical issue, it was a crisis of faith in technology, in progress, and in the belief that human ingenuity could conquer the laws of nature. The 1940s were a time when aviation was still young. Only a few decades earlier, the Wright brothers had taken their first fragile flight at Kitty Hawk. Now, engineers were grappling with forces that had never been measured before. The Lightning's struggles reflected the growing pains of an entire generation of engineers pushing the boundaries of possibility. Every crash was a lesson written in courage and loss. In the midst of this turmoil, Lockheed's management faced mounting pressure from Washington. Reports of fatal crashes were drawing attention from military leadership, and there were whispers of canceling further orders. But one man within Lockheed refused to give up. He believed that every problem had a solution, no matter how complex. That man was a civilian engineer named Kelly Johnson, a brilliant and unconventional thinker whose genius would soon turn despair into triumph. Yet at this moment in history, before his breakthrough, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. In the hangars of Burbank, where mechanics worked under the California sun, you could almost feel the tension in the air. Engineers walked among the partially assembled fuselages, studying every rivet and seam. Pilots stood near the aircraft they both loved and feared, talking quietly about the ones who hadn't made it back. Flight logs bore the names of the lost. Letters were sent to families. The P-38, the Lightning, was a marvel, but it was also a mystery. It was a bird that could soar higher than any other, but it sometimes refused to come back down safely. This was the moment when innovation was tested not by resources, but by resolve. America needed the Lightning, and the Lightning needed saving. The enemy was advancing, the skies were contested, and the clock was ticking. Every day without a solution meant more lives at risk and more missions in jeopardy. The very fate of air superiority in two theaters of war rested on the ability to fix one deadly flaw. And so, in the crucible of war, under the shadow of loss, the story of the P-38's crisis became a story of human determination. It was the prelude to a transformation that would redefine aviation itself. The Lightning's problem was not just a mechanical puzzle. It was the edge of discovery, a boundary between what was known and what could be learned. And on the other side of that boundary waited the man and the idea that would make America's P-38s almost untouchable. In every great crisis, there arises a figure who refuses to bow to failure. Someone who looks at the same facts as everyone else, but sees something different. When the P-38 Lightning stood on the brink of disaster, when engineers and pilots alike began to doubt whether the aircraft could be saved, that figure appeared in the form of a quiet but fearless civilian engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson. His name would later become legendary in aviation, but in those early years of the 1940s, he was simply an unorthodox thinker working at Lockheed, a man whose mind seemed to race faster than any aircraft he could design. Johnson didn't wear a military uniform. He didn't command squadrons or salute superiors. His weapon was imagination, and his battlefield was the drawing board. At the time, Lockheed Aircraft Company was a hive of restless energy. The war had transformed it from a modest California manufacturer into one of America's most vital engines of innovation. Its engineers worked long hours under the glare of fluorescent lights, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, sketching, testing, and rebuilding prototypes in an endless cycle of trial and error. Each new design promised victory, each failure carried the weight of lives lost. Among these men, Kelly Johnson stood apart. He was young, outspoken, and utterly unwilling to accept limits. His colleagues described him as both brilliant and infuriating, a man who argued fiercely, but always with purpose. When others said something could not be done, he didn't dismiss them. He simply went off to prove them wrong. Johnson had already made his mark before the P-38 crisis began. He had been instrumental in refining earlier Lockheed models, earning a reputation for intuitive genius. He believed that good engineering was not just about numbers. It was about understanding how things wanted to work. To him, an airplane was almost alive, a thing of balance and beauty. He spoke often about listening to the airplane as though machines had voices. That approach made him unconventional, even eccentric, but it also made him one of the few people capable of tackling the Lightning's mysterious and deadly flaw. When reports of fatal dives began reaching Lockheed's engineering department, Johnson paid close attention. While others focused on mechanical explanations, hydraulic failures, structural weaknesses, or pilot error, he sensed something deeper. He suspected the P-38's problem wasn't in its parts, but in the invisible forces around it. He read every report, studied every crash analysis, and pored over the limited aerodynamic data available. What he found was both alarming and exhilarating. The P-38 was entering speeds and pressures that no wind tunnel on Earth could accurately replicate at that time. In a sense, the airplane was exploring territory beyond human understanding. To most engineers, that was terrifying. To Kelly Johnson, it was an invitation. He began to consider the possibility that the P-38's control lock was not a failure of design, but a symptom of success, that the aircraft had become so fast it was brushing against the limits of physics. The idea was radical. In 1941, the term compressibility was only beginning to appear in scientific journals. The concept that air could behave differently at near-sonic speeds was not yet fully accepted. Many believed the sound barrier was an unbreakable wall, that approaching it would cause any aircraft to disintegrate. But Johnson refused to be intimidated by theory. He believed that nature could be understood if one was clever enough to ask the right questions. He spent long nights in Lockheed's design office, working on sketches by hand, calculating airflow patterns, and testing small-scale models. He often clashed with company executives who worried about costs and timelines. He was known to storm out of meetings, muttering that bureaucracy killed more ideas than physics ever could. Yet beneath his fiery temper was a fierce sense of responsibility. Every pilot who died in a P-38 weighed on him personally. He took it as a personal failure that his creation, an airplane meant to protect lives, had instead taken them. He was determined to fix it, no matter how long it took. Johnson's leadership style was as unconventional as his mind. He gathered a small group of trusted engineers, a team that would later become the foundation of his legendary Skunk Works division, and set them to work in a separate, isolated part of the factory. There, away from corporate distractions, he encouraged them to experiment freely. He imposed one rule above all others: speed. Be quick, be quiet, and be on time, he would say. He believed that innovation thrived in small teams with direct communication. No committees, no red tape, just pure focus. This approach was revolutionary in an era dominated by rigid military oversight and slow bureaucratic processes. As the team studied the P-38's high-speed dives, Johnson proposed a daring hypothesis. What if, instead of fighting the airflow changes, they could find a way to work with them? Perhaps the answer was not to redesign the entire aircraft, but to find a small, clever adjustment that could restore balance in the midst of chaos. It was an idea rooted in both simplicity and elegance, hallmarks of Johnson's genius. While others imagined large mechanical overhauls, he looked for a subtle trick that could make the airplane listen to its pilot again, even when the air screamed around it. This mindset, the refusal to accept the impossible, defined Kelly Johnson's entire career. When Lockheed test pilots warned him that the Lightning's dives were uncontrollable, he didn't dismiss their fear. Instead, he rode in the chase planes himself, observing every movement. He wanted to see the danger with his own eyes. He understood that real progress required risk, and that true innovation could not happen from behind a desk. His hands-on approach inspired trust among pilots, who came to see him not as a detached engineer, but as one of them, a man willing to share their peril in the pursuit of safety. As he dug deeper into the aerodynamic mysteries of the Lightning, Johnson also faced skepticism from higher authorities. Some within the Air Corps believed the P-38 was simply too advanced for its time, that the problem could never be solved without slowing the aircraft down or redesigning it entirely. Slowing it down would have meant giving up its greatest strength, speed. To Johnson, that was unacceptable. If it can fly that fast, he once said, then we can make it safe at that speed. Those words captured the essence of his philosophy: progress must never retreat from possibility. He began experimenting with small model wings in Lockheed's test facilities, adjusting their shapes and angles to observe airflow patterns. He consulted aerodynamicists, mathematicians, and even university researchers, searching for patterns in the chaos of data. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The problem lay not in the wings themselves, but in how the airflow changed around the tail when shockwaves formed at high speeds. The nose dropped, the center of lift shifted, and the tail surfaces lost authority. The plane was, quite literally, being forced downward by the invisible hand of compressed air. To most engineers, that revelation was disheartening, a confirmation that the laws of physics were simply unbeatable. But to Kelly Johnson, it was a roadmap. If he couldn't prevent the shockwave from forming, perhaps he could give the pilot a new tool to counteract it. What if a small device could alter the flow of air, just enough to restore control during a dive? He sketched, erased, and redrew until an idea began to form. Not a major redesign, not a massive modification, but a subtle aerodynamic trick. It would be small, elegant, and counterintuitive. Exactly the kind of idea everyone else would call impossible. But before that breakthrough came, Johnson's battle was not just technical, it was also psychological. Within Lockheed, some doubted his obsession. Military officials demanded quick answers and time was running out. The war was intensifying and every unsolved issue meant more casualties in the field. Johnson worked tirelessly, often sleeping on a cot in his office. He refused to let failure dictate the fate of the Lightning. His confidence inspired those around him. Kelly never told us what couldn't be done. One engineer later recalled, he told us what had to be done, and expected us to find a way. That mentality, the refusal to accept defeat, transformed Lockheed's culture. It set a precedent for every future project the company would undertake, from jet fighters to spy planes. Johnson's team began to embody a spirit of relentless innovation. They approached every problem not as a barrier, but as an opportunity to learn. When the wind tunnels couldn't simulate transonic airflow, they built their own test rigs. When data was scarce, they invented new instruments. Every obstacle became a stepping stone. At the same time, Johnson maintained an extraordinary connection with the pilots who risked their lives in his creations. He believed that no amount of theory could replace first-hand experience. He talked to them, listened to their fears, and treated their feedback as gospel. Many of them were barely out of their 20s, men who carried both courage and vulnerability in equal measure. They trusted Johnson because he respected them. In return, they gave him insights that no laboratory could provide. Their courage became the raw material of his innovation. Eventually, his determination began to draw attention from the top brass of the Army Air Forces. They saw in Johnson not just a problem solver, but a visionary, someone who could think beyond the present. His reputation grew rapidly, though he never sought fame. For him, success was measured not in accolades but in results, in the roar of engines and the survival of pilots. Every time a P-38 took off, he felt personally responsible for its fate. Every safe landing was a victory. Every loss a lesson. Kelly Johnson's refusal to accept impossible was more than a personality trait, it was a philosophy of life. He believed that problems only remained impossible until someone found the courage to challenge them. In a time when science was still catching up to the realities of high-speed flight, he dared to think beyond equations. He combined intuition with experimentation theory with audacity. His genius lay not just in his intellect, but in his attitude, a belief that the solution to every mystery was already out there, waiting for the right mind to see it. The story of how one civilian engineer looked at tragedy and saw opportunity is one of the most inspiring chapters in aviation history. Before Johnson's breakthrough invention would make the P-38 untouchable, his courage to stand alone against doubt, fear and accepted limits became the engine of progress itself. At a time when others saw the lightning's flaw as the end of its story, Kelly Johnson saw it as the beginning of discovery. That conviction, that relentless faith in human ingenuity, would soon change the course of the war and redefine what mankind believed was possible in the skies. When Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed finally arrived at their breakthrough, it did not emerge in a moment of lightning bolt inspiration. It came slowly, born out of sleepless nights, piles of sketches, test failures, and an unyielding belief that a simple idea could solve a deadly problem. The P-38 Lightning's curse, its uncontrollable dives, had claimed lives, shaken confidence, and threatened to erase one of America's most promising aircraft from the skies. Every test flight seemed to reinforce the same grim pattern. Once the aircraft entered a high-speed dive, the controls would freeze, the tail would lock, and the pilot would be helpless. No amount of strength or training could overcome the forces that pinned the stick forward. But in the mind of Kelly Johnson, the answer was hiding in plain sight. The P-38 didn't need a complete redesign, it needed a way to change the conversation with the air itself. In those tense months of experimentation, Johnson's small team worked in isolation, stripped of bureaucracy and surrounded by urgency. They tested scale models, studied airflow diagrams, and built crude mock-ups out of wood and aluminum. Each test brought them closer to the truth. The air that flowed around the Lightning's wings behaved normally until it reached very high speeds. Then, it suddenly changed character. The flow of air would separate from the surface of the wing, forming invisible shockwaves that shifted the center of lift backward. This aerodynamic shift forced the nose downward and increased the dive even further. The faster the plane went, the stronger the downward push became. Pilots who tried to pull back only made matters worse. The harder they fought, the faster they fell. To understand the scale of this problem, one must imagine what those pilots experienced. As the P-38 plunged toward the Earth at speeds over 500 miles per hour, the airframe trembled violently. The controls became as rigid as stone. The cockpit shook, gauges blurred, and the roar of the engines merged with the scream of the wind. A pilot could see the ground racing upward, knowing that at any second the aircraft might shatter. In those final moments, survival depended on luck, not skill. That was the horror Johnson was determined to eliminate. He believed that if he could just restore a small measure of control during that critical phase of flight, pilots would have the power to recover. The question was how. Most engineers were trapped by conventional thinking. They assumed that only a large redesign, perhaps a bigger tail or thicker wings, could counteract the forces of compressibility. But Johnson saw the problem differently. He did not want to fight the laws of aerodynamics, he wanted to cooperate with them. He asked himself a deceptively simple question. If the airflow wants to push the nose down, can we give the airplane a small helping hand to push it back up? That single thought sparked the beginning of his revolutionary idea. Johnson began to experiment with small flaps located underneath the wings, just ahead of the main landing gear. These would not be ordinary flaps like those used during takeoff or landing. They would be small, strong panels that could deploy only when the airplane was in a steep dive. When extended, they would slightly change the distribution of lift under the wings, shifting the aerodynamic forces forward and countering the nose-down moment that caused the aircraft to lock. It was an elegant solution, one that used the airplane's own airflow to restore balance. The concept seemed too simple to be true. Many at Lockheed dismissed it at first, calling it a gimmick. Military officials, desperate for results but wary of unproven ideas, were skeptical. How could a small metal flap possibly solve a problem that had killed dozens of pilots? Johnson faced intense scrutiny, yet he remained unmoved. He built models, ran calculations, and presented his findings with calm authority. He explained that the flaps would not need to generate massive lift. They only needed to alter the pressure distribution enough to let the tail regain control. It was not brute force that would save the Lightning, it was finesse. The first prototype of these so-called dive recovery flaps was built quickly and installed on a test P-38. The test pilot chosen for the mission was one of Lockheed's best, a man accustomed to danger but aware of the risks. The world held its breath as the Lightning climbed into the sky over the California desert. Engineers on the ground watched with binoculars as the silver aircraft climbed, leveled, and then tipped forward into a dive. The engines screamed. The speed climbed. The aircraft began to tremble, the familiar warning signs of compressibility. Everyone expected the same outcome they had seen before. But then, at a predetermined altitude, the pilot extended the small flaps. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, the nose began to rise. The stick loosened. The pilot pulled out smoothly from the dive and leveled off. The P-38 had recovered. When the pilot landed, the ground crew rushed to him. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but his voice was steady. "It works," he said simply. Those two words marked the turning point in the Lightning's history. The impossible had been made possible. The news spread quickly through Lockheed and the Air Corps. Engineers who had nearly lost faith found themselves astonished by the simplicity of the solution. What had eluded the world's best aerodynamicists turned out to be a matter of inches of metal and moments of timing. Kelly Johnson's flaps transformed the P-38 from a dangerous prototype into one of the safest high-speed aircraft of the war. For the first time, pilots could dive at extreme speeds and still pull out under control. They could use the Lightning's speed not as a liability, but as a weapon. Johnson's innovation soon became a triumph of practical genius. The dive recovery flaps were retrofitted to existing aircraft and built into all new P-38s rolling off the production line. Reports from combat squadrons began to change almost overnight. Pilots who once feared diving now used it as a tactical maneuver. Japanese and German fighters, which once relied on steep dives to escape pursuit, suddenly found that the P-38 could follow them down and emerge unscathed. Allied pilots gained a new confidence, knowing that their aircraft would not betray them. The sky, once a place of dread for Lightning crews, became a field of opportunity. The beauty of Johnson's idea lay not just in its effectiveness, but in its efficiency. It required no complex redesign, no major overhaul, and no expensive retooling. It was a perfect example of how insight could outweigh brute engineering. It was, quite literally, an impossible trick. One that seemed too clever to be real, yet worked flawlessly in practice. It was the kind of solution that redefined what it meant to be an engineer, not merely a builder of machines, but a problem solver guided by imagination. For the pilots, the difference was night and day. Before the invention of the dive flaps, every steep descent carried a whisper of death. Afterward, it became a source of power. Test pilots began to push the Lightning harder, exploring dives from greater altitudes, higher speeds, and tighter turns. Each time the flaps performed flawlessly. In one celebrated test, a P-38 equipped with the new system reached speeds that had previously been considered suicidal. Yet it recovered as smoothly as if it had been flying level. Engineers who witnessed the flight later described the moment as watching the laws of nature change before our eyes. The United States Army Air Forces quickly approved the modification, and Lockheed began producing retrofit kits for units already in the field. Within months, Lightning squadrons from Europe to the Pacific had adopted the improvement. The change was so dramatic that it altered the reputation of the aircraft entirely. The P-38 was no longer the fighter that killed its own pilots. It was now the aircraft that could do what no enemy plane could match. It could dive faster, fly farther, and strike deeper. Its pilots, once cautious, became confident and daring. The Lightning's elegant twin-boom design, once feared as a flaw, now became a symbol of resilience. Behind all this success stood Kelly Johnson's unshakable faith in simplicity. He often said that every technical problem had an elegant solution if one was willing to look past complexity. His dive recovery flaps were a masterclass in that philosophy. They did not defy physics, they worked with it. They didn't overpower nature's forces, they redirected them. In that sense, his invention was not merely mechanical, it was philosophical. It embodied the idea that mastery comes not from domination, but from understanding. The significance of Johnson's possible trick extended far beyond the P-38 itself. The discovery that airflow could be manipulated to restore control at near-sonic speeds opened an entirely new chapter in aerodynamics. Engineers studying the Lightning's behavior began to realize that the so-called sound barrier was not an unbreakable wall, but a threshold that could be crossed with the right design. The lessons learned from those dive flaps would later inform the development of jet aircraft, transonic fighters, and even the research planes that would one day break the speed of sound. In a very real sense, those small metal panels under the wings of the P-38 pointed the way toward the future of aviation. In wartime, however, the value of innovation is measured not in scientific papers, but in lives saved and battles won. With its newfound stability, the P-38 Lightning became one of the most formidable weapons in the Allied arsenal. It was the aircraft that intercepted Japanese communications and carried out the mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. It escorted bombers across Europe, struck enemy shipping in the Pacific, and became the personal mount of many of America's top aces. Every victory it achieved bore the unseen signature of Kelly Johnson's dive recovery flaps. Each successful dive, each narrow escape, each safe return from combat was a testament to the power of that small, ingenious idea. What made the story so extraordinary was not just that the flaps worked, but that they symbolized a deeper truth about innovation itself, that sometimes the greatest leaps forward come from those willing to look where others refuse to. While much of the world was still bound by old theories, Johnson dared to ask new questions. He believed that progress was a dialogue between imagination and reality, and his dive flaps were the perfect expression of that belief. In their simplicity lay a lesson that would echo through generations, that the solution to an impossible problem often lies in the smallest, most overlooked detail. When the war ended and the history of the P-38 was written, the dive recovery flaps were often described as a footnote in a long list of wartime innovations. But for those who lived it, the engineers who designed it, the pilots who tested it, and the soldiers who owed their lives to it, it was much more than that. It was proof that the human mind, armed with determination and curiosity, could outwit even the harshest laws of nature. It was proof that courage on the ground could save courage in the air. And it was proof that sometimes, a little piece of metal could carry the weight of a nation's hope. When the dive recovery flaps were finally perfected and fitted onto America's P-38 Lightnings, something extraordinary began to happen. What had once been an aircraft with a mixed reputation, admired for its speed and range but distrusted for its deadly dives, suddenly became the scourge of the skies. The same plane that had cost so many test pilots their lives was now saving them in combat, and not just saving them, but giving them a weapon unlike anything their enemies possessed. The transformation of the P-38 was not simply a technical success, it was a strategic turning point that reshaped the balance of air power in World War II. By 1943, the skies over Europe and the Pacific had become brutal battlegrounds. The Axis powers ruled vast stretches of airspace with veteran pilots and well-developed aircraft. The Japanese Zero was fast and agile, able to twist and turn like a bird of prey. The German Foch, Wolf and Messerschmitt fighters were powerful, sleek, and deadly. The Allies, meanwhile, were racing against time to develop machines that could match or surpass them. The P-38 Lightning had been one of those hopeful experiments. A twin-engine fighter unlike any other in the world. But despite its promise, it had nearly been grounded by its own aerodynamic flaws. That all changed when a civilian's so-called impossible trick turned the Lightning into one of the most feared aircraft in the war. Almost overnight, pilots who had once hesitated to fly the P-38 began to volunteer for it. They knew now that their aircraft could dive faster, climb higher, and fly farther than almost any fighter the enemy could field. It could cover enormous distances, escorting bombers deep into hostile territory where single-engine fighters couldn't go. It could chase down retreating foes who once relied on diving away for safety. It could strike, retreat, and strike again, all without losing control. That newfound confidence was a powerful force multiplier. The war in the air was not just about technology, it was about morale, belief, and daring. And the P-38 gave all three back to the Allied pilots. The change was especially dramatic in the Pacific theater, where long distances and open skies defined nearly every engagement. Before the Lightning's transformation, American pilots often found themselves outmaneuvered by Japanese Zeros, whose agility and tight turning radii made them almost impossible to match in dogfights. But the Zero had a weakness. It was lightly built, lacking armor and firepower compared to the robust American designs. The P-38, with its twin engines, heavy armament, and newly found control at high speeds, was perfectly suited to exploit that weakness. Instead of engaging in slow, twisting fights where the Zero excelled, Lightning pilots used their speed and altitude to dive, attack, and climb away before the enemy could react. The boom and zoom tactic, once too dangerous because of the Lightning's dive control problem, became its deadliest weapon once the dive recovery flaps were installed. Reports from the Pacific began to pour in. Lightning squadrons were cutting through enemy formations like a hot blade through fabric. Japanese pilots, who had once mocked the P-38 for its size and stiffness, suddenly found themselves helpless against it. The Lightning's guns, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20 cannon mounted in the nose, were devastating in their accuracy. Unlike other fighters whose guns were mounted in the wings and required convergence at a specific range, the Lightning's centerline armament allowed it to strike with deadly precision at long distances. Pilots learned to fire in brief, controlled bursts, and often, a single pass was enough to send an enemy spiraling into the sea. One of the most iconic demonstrations of the P-38's new capabilities came in April 1943. In a mission that changed the course of the Pacific War, American intelligence had intercepted a Japanese communication revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. It was an opportunity the Allies could not ignore. 16 P-38 Lightnings equipped with extra fuel tanks and led by Major John W. Mitchell were assigned to intercept him. The mission required a 1,000-mile round trip, far beyond the range of any other fighter of the time. Flying low over the ocean, the Lightnings arrived precisely on schedule, appearing like silver ghosts over the jungle canopy. When Yamamoto's transport and escort fighters appeared, the Americans pounced. The Japanese Zeros tried to dive and escape, but the Lightnings followed them down, unflinching, controlled, and deadly. The possible dive that had once doomed the P-38 was now the maneuver that sealed its enemy's fate. Within minutes, Yamamoto's plane was shot down. The mission, Operation Vengeance, was a flawless execution of planning, skill, and technological ingenuity. It proved not only the Lightning's range and precision, but also that its new control systems made it capable of the most demanding missions of the war. From that moment, the P-38 became a symbol of reach, power, and reliability. Across the Pacific, it escorted bombers on long-range raids, intercepted enemy reconnaissance planes, and destroyed supply convoys with surgical precision. Pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles Lindbergh, who flew combat missions as a civilian advisor, used the Lightning to devastating effect. Bong and Maguire became America's top aces, scoring dozens of victories, many of them achieved in head on dives that would have been impossible before Kelly Johnson's innovation. Lindbergh, once the face of civilian aviation, returned to the skies to train young pilots in how to extend the range and performance of the P-38. He was astonished by how the dive flaps made the aircraft not only safer but smoother and more responsive. It was, he said, like taming lightning itself. The same transformation unfolded over Europe. In the Mediterranean, P-38s led precision strikes against German supply lines and airfields in North Africa and Italy. In the cold skies over northern Europe, they escorted bombers deep into German territory, where the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces waited. Before the Lightning's improvement, many bomber crews dreaded those missions. Single-engine fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-51 Mustang could not always cover the full distance. But the twin-engine P-38 could. Its long-range and high-altitude performance meant that bomber formations were never alone. The Luftwaffe soon learned that attacking a formation protected by Lightnings was a costly mistake. The P-38 could dive after interceptors, fire accurately from long range, and return to altitude before the enemy could counterattack. This newfound control in dives gave the Lightning pilots a sense of invulnerability. It also changed the tactics of the air war itself. Where once the Allies had to avoid steep dives for fear of losing aircraft, now they used them as deliberate maneuvers to break enemy formations, attack ground targets, or evade pursuit. The psychological shift was immense. Every pilot knew that when things went wrong, when an enemy locked onto their tail or flak filled the sky, they could push the nose down and rely on their aircraft to bring them safely back out. That confidence turned good pilots into great ones, and great pilots into legends. The German Luftwaffe began to fear the sound of the twin-engine roar that announced the arrival of a Lightning squadron. They called it the Fork-tailed Devil, a name that captured both awe and terror. In air-to-air combat, the P-38 proved particularly effective against German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Its heavy armament and long loiter time allowed it to patrol for hours, hunting enemy planes at will. In ground attack roles, it became a precision strike weapon, capable of carrying bombs and rockets while maintaining the agility to escape at high speed. Every dive, every low-level attack, every steep pursuit was made possible by the same impossible flaps that had once seemed like a desperate experiment. The impact rippled beyond tactics and battles. It reached the very heart of morale. For the first time, pilots trusted their machines completely. Maintenance crews worked with renewed pride, knowing they were tending to an aircraft that was changing the course of the war. Commanders could plan longer, deeper, riskier missions, confident that their pilots had the tools to return. Even the enemy began to recognize that the Lightning represented a new kind of challenge, an aircraft that could outfly, outfight, and outthink them. What makes this transformation so remarkable is that it was not achieved through brute force or massive redesign. It came from understanding a problem deeply enough to solve it elegantly. The dive recovery flaps did not make the P-38 stronger in muscle, they made it smarter in movement. That intelligence, that subtle harmony with the air, is what turned a flawed machine into a legend. And in doing so, the Lightning became more than just a plane, it became a symbol of American ingenuity. Its success reminded both the Allies and their enemies that the United States was capable of solving problems that others deemed unsolvable. Every time a P-38 thundered into the sky, it carried with it the spirit of innovation, the belief that no obstacle was truly impossible. That belief, more than any weapon or technology, was what ultimately turned the tide of the air war. By the final years of the conflict, the Lightning had become a fixture in every major theater. It flew reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, mapping invasion routes and photographing troop movements. It delivered devastating strikes against supply lines and industrial targets. It escorted bombers on raids deep into enemy heartlands, sometimes flying missions that lasted 8 or 9 hours. And at the heart of every one of those missions was a quiet piece of engineering brilliance. A small set of flaps that allowed the aircraft to do what no other could. To the men who flew it, the P-38 was more than a machine, it was a partner, a guardian, a weapon of precision and reliability. Pilots who once feared its high-speed dives now trusted it with their lives. And that trust, the bond between man and machine forged by innovation, helped shape the course of the war's outcome. The Lightning gave the Allies the ability to fight on their own terms, to strike where and when they chose, and to return home safely. It was the edge they needed in a war where every edge mattered. As historians later reflected on the air war, many agreed that the P-38's transformation marked one of the most dramatic reversals in aviation history. From a near failure to an icon of dominance, it represented everything the American war effort stood for: creativity, persistence, and the refusal to accept defeat. In every theater, in every campaign, the Lightning's shadow fell long and powerful. And behind that shadow was a single innovation, a civilian's brilliant, impossible trick that changed not just one airplane, but the entire course of aerial warfare. In the aftermath of World War II, when the skies over Europe and the Pacific finally fell silent, the men and machines that had once roared through those heavens became legends. Among them, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning stood apart, not just for its twin-boom silhouette or its unmatched combat record, but for the mind that had made its triumph possible. Kelly Johnson, the quiet civilian who had dared to attempt the impossible, left behind more than an aircraft. He left behind a philosophy, a way of thinking that would shape the next generation of aviation, space exploration, and engineering itself. His impossible trick, the dive recovery flaps that transformed the Lightning from a dangerous prototype into a world beater, was more than a mechanical fix. It was a declaration of faith in human ingenuity, a reminder that creativity and courage could bend even the hardest limits of nature. When the war ended, the Lightning's story became part of aviation folklore. Pilots spoke of it with reverence, mechanics with pride, and historians with awe. But for Johnson, the story was only beginning. He never saw himself as a hero or even as a genius. He saw himself as a problem solver, and that humility became the cornerstone of his legacy. In every design he touched, from the P-38 to the U-2 spy plane to the SR-71 Blackbird, Johnson carried forward the same spirit that had driven him to solve the P-38's deadly dive. He believed that every challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed, could be conquered through understanding, experimentation, and bold simplicity. Johnson's work on the P-38 had proven something vital, that one individual, even outside the military hierarchy, could alter the fate of a war through innovation alone. He wasn't a general or a politician. He wasn't flying missions or commanding squadrons. He was an engineer, a civilian surrounded by blueprints and wind tunnels, yet his fingerprints were on every victory the Lightning achieved. That realization sent ripples through the aviation world. It shattered the old notion that war-winning ideas had to come from the battlefield. Sometimes the most decisive breakthroughs came from quiet workshops and restless minds willing to challenge convention. The P-38's transformation was not just about physics, it was about the courage to imagine something new. When the dive recovery flaps first appeared on Johnson's sketches, many dismissed them as naive, even laughable. But Johnson understood something fundamental about innovation, that every great idea begins as an absurdity. The difference between genius and folly lies in persistence, and Kelly Johnson had persistence in abundance. He never accepted that good enough was truly good enough. For him, every design had to strive toward perfection, not just in performance but in elegance. He once said, "An engineer who doesn't believe in miracles isn't a very good engineer." That belief, more than any blueprint, defined his work. As the world rebuilt after the war, Johnson's reputation grew rapidly. The success of the P-38 gave him the freedom to lead his own experimental division within Lockheed, a small, highly secretive unit that would come to be known as the Skunk Works. From that unassuming workshop would emerge some of the most revolutionary aircraft in human history. The lessons Johnson learned from the P-38, simplicity, trust in small teams, and the courage to take risks, became the foundation of Skunk Works' philosophy. It was there that he and his engineers would design aircraft decades ahead of their time. The echoes of the P-38's innovation could be found in every project that followed. When Johnson created the U-2, the high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that would fly over the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, he faced challenges eerily similar to those he had conquered years before. Once again, he was pushing the limits of aerodynamics, crafting a plane that could soar higher and faster than anything else in existence, yet remain stable and controllable. The same meticulous attention to airflow, pressure distribution, and stability that birthed the dive recovery flaps now guided his hand as he shaped the U-2's impossibly thin wings. The lessons learned in the P-38's screaming dives were reborn in the U-2's silent ascents. Then came the SR-71 Blackbird, the ultimate embodiment of Kelly Johnson's genius. Capable of flying at over 3 times the speed of sound and at altitudes higher than 80,000 feet, it was an aircraft so advanced that even radar struggled to see it. And yet, beneath all its futuristic technology, one could still trace the DNA of the Lightning. The same elegant engineering, the same trust in the physics of flight, the same understanding that control at extreme speed required harmony, not brute force. The Blackbird, like the Lightning, danced on the edge of the impossible. It didn't fight the air. It flowed with it. But Johnson's legacy was not only written in metal and matched numbers. It was written in people, in the generations of engineers and dreamers who learned from his example. He taught them that creativity demanded discipline, that boldness required humility, and that progress was born not from wealth or luck but from relentless curiosity. He believed in the power of small teams, in giving engineers direct control and accountability. His rules for Skunk works became legendary. No bureaucracy, minimal paperwork, maximum trust. He understood that the same kind of focus that had saved the P-38 from disaster was only possible when talented people were allowed to think freely, act quickly, and believe deeply in their work. The ripple effects of Johnson's approach extended far beyond aviation. The mindset that powered the Skunk works became a model for innovation across industries, from software to space exploration. It showed the world that revolutionary ideas are not born from vast committees, but from individuals willing to take ownership of the unknown. And that belief, rooted in the moment when a small flap on a World War II fighter changed the laws of flight, became one of America's greatest intellectual exports. Even decades later, pilots who had flown the P-38 during the war continued to speak of Johnson with reverence. Many credited him personally for their survival. Some had seen their friends perish in lightning dives before the invention of the recovery flaps. Others had pulled out of dives themselves, alive only because of his idea. To them, Johnson wasn't just an engineer. He was a guardian angel in coveralls, a man who had made their bravery possible. They often said that every P-38 carried two pilots, one in the cockpit and one invisible, sitting somewhere back at Lockheed with a pencil and an unbreakable imagination. The civilian who had once been mocked for his impossible trick eventually received the highest honors his nation could bestow. He earned the Collier Trophy, the Medal of Freedom, and countless other awards. But the recognition that meant most to him didn't come from politicians or generals. It came from the pilots themselves, from letters, handshakes, and quiet words of thanks. He often kept those letters folded in his desk drawer, more valuable to him than any medal. They were proof that his belief in the power of one idea, and one person, had made a difference. In time, historians came to see Kelly Johnson's work on the P-38 as the moment when engineering became as decisive a weapon as any bomb or bullet. The dive recovery flaps were a small piece of metal, yet their impact rippled through history. They symbolized a bridge between human intellect and mechanical might, proof that even in an age of destruction, creation could still lead the way. In that sense, Johnson's legacy transcended war itself. His work reminded the world that technology, when guided by vision, could serve humanity rather than destroy it. The civilian genius, as he was later called, embodied the best of the American spirit. He was self-taught, self-driven, and endlessly curious. He came from modest beginnings, yet his ideas reached the edge of the atmosphere. He lived by a code that valued simplicity, honesty, and courage. When asked late in life how he wanted to be remembered, he replied, "I just want to be remembered as someone who solved problems." But in truth, he did far more than that. He redefined what it meant to solve them. He showed that the frontier of possibility is not a place, it's a mindset. Today, every time a stealth jet slips, unseen through the clouds, or a spacecraft re-enters the atmosphere with precision, a faint echo of Johnson's thinking can be found in its design. The engineers who built those machines stand on the shoulders of his philosophy. That the hardest problems are often the simplest in disguise, that innovation begins with a question, and that courage is not limited to the battlefield. Kelly Johnson's courage was of a different kind. The courage to look at an unsolved problem and whisper, "There's an answer here. We just haven't seen it yet." The legacy of the P-38's transformation lives on not only in the skies, but in the culture of invention it inspired. Museums around the world display the lightning as a symbol of engineering triumph, a reminder of how a civilian's insight altered the course of a global war. Visitors stand beneath its silver wings and marvel at its sleek lines, unaware that the small panels beneath its wings, barely visible to the casual eye, once represented the boundary between life and death, between fear and mastery. They are reminded that history often turns not on the grand gestures of nations, but on the quiet brilliance of individuals. In classrooms and laboratories, the story of Kelly Johnson is told not as a tale of machines, but as a lesson in perseverance. It teaches young innovators that no obstacle is insurmountable, no idea too small to matter. It teaches that genius often wears ordinary clothes, and that greatness is measured not in fame, but in impact. It is the story of how one civilian, armed only with intellect and determination, made the impossible real, and in doing so, helped define the age of flight. The world that followed him, the world of jet engines, space travel, and stealth, owes a silent debt to that moment of inspiration during the darkest days of war. The dive recovery flaps of the P-38 were not just a technical invention, they were a statement of belief, that the human mind could always find a way forward, even when surrounded by chaos. And long after the last lightning faded from the sky, that belief continued to soar, higher and faster than any plane ever could.